This week on The Futurists, Rob and Brett are back in the hot seat. The concept of quantum day is a day when quantum computers can break all existing RSA encryption that we use. We're talking about the banking system, the telecommunication system, and the internet. If you aren't on a quantum cloud at that point using quantum encryption technology, all of the existing RSA type encryption could be broken.
Hi, Brett. Long time.
Hey!
Good to see you, man.
How are you?
I'm fantastic. I just got back from New York, and man, I got to tell you, New York is booming. I had not been there for a year, and I was thrilled to see everybody out in the street. The weather was great. The restaurants were packed. The stores are bustling and booming. It felt like pre-COVID New York. I don't think that's probably true yet, but it sure felt like it.
Well, it's taken long enough, right? But it's still, I haven't lived in New York now for a couple of years, obviously. But I do think that, New York, when it's buzzing, it's pretty unique, obviously. There's a few cities like that in the world. Obviously, Dubai, I think, would fall into that category these days.
London, of course.
London, Hong Kong used to be, but I don't know now. Singapore, Bangkok for sure.
Yeah, Bangkok.
Mumbai. And of course, Mumbai, Beijing, Shanghai.
But the city people compare to New York the most is Sydney, Australia, for a good reason, actually. Yeah, for good reason. There's the same level of sophistication and hipness and style, and it's sort of a fashion center for Australia. So in some respects, that's accurate. It's also extraordinarily expensive, so that makes it fit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Sydney, I think, is like the second most expensive real estate per capita or something in the world right now. And, Tokyo, number one. So even, if you compare it with the average annual salary, that's the metric that they use, right? So if you go back to like the 1960s in the States or in, place like Sydney, you could buy a family home on average for 2 or 3 times the average annual salary. Now it's up to something like 19 or 20 times the average annual salary. So it means that housing is extremely unaffordable for the next generation of kids, and in Sydney, they're saying that only about 30% of the population under 25 will ever be able to afford to own a home in Sydney.
Interesting time for real estate. Part of it is that there's just so many people in that baby boom generation that have property, but also there's such an excess of wealth at some levels of society, and real estate's a good asset class, and so there are people buying second homes. All those things are factors in driving up the price of real estate. Here in the U.S., there's a couple things happening in terms of rent. People have been complaining about the rent for a long time, since about 2016, because rents have been really increasing fast.
Rent affordability is a huge issue.
There's a couple of lawsuits underway, antitrust lawsuits, brought privately, complaints that were brought in Tennessee and one other state, about collusion among landlords, about big corporate landlords who are colluding on price fixing. Well, this last week in the U.S., the FBI and the Department of Justice raided the offices of one of the biggest corporate landlords in the U.S.
Wow.
Claiming that they have been colluding using a piece of software to fix prices between companies that would normally compete. And as a result, the prices of rental units in many U.S. cities like Atlanta, have increased by 80% in the last 8 years. Yeah. So they're almost doubling. And, if you talk to anyone who's looking for an apartment, that's what you hear in every city now is, wow, it's just too expensive. Half my income is going to go to rent.
And it's crazy. I mean, I was used to that in Hong Kong, but, in the States. It's interesting that half of the renters in the United States, this is data from January. This was Bloomberg report, but CNN reported it. Half of renters in the United States have found themselves paying more than they can afford in rent. So, basically saying it's now become unaffordable for the majority of Americans renting in the US. And, of course, there's BlackRock and others getting into sort of private real estate holdings now. And, the concern is that we're creating a sort of permanent renter class and that, housing will will get out of the zone of affordability for the majority of the middle class, over the coming decade or so. So
Yeah, it's a
that's
kind of
the
degradation of
concern.
labor as well, because people who
Yes,
work for a living are going to give up more and more of what they take home to a capital owning landlord
right.
class.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty
And
bad. It's like
that's
a
even
retreat
before we
back
start
into the
talking about
past.
healthcare and all of those other things, right?
Well, that's the other big factor. So this is another futurist related topic is the cost of insuring a home has skyrocketed in the last few
Yeah.
years. Here in California, my house, my price of my home insurance has doubled and doubled again. And apparently, I have a good deal relative to other people. Apparently, it's not as high as it could be. A lot of factors for that. Of course, the one factor is that we have fires every year now, and then of course, following the fires, because there's no land, there's no trees or forestry on the hillside, we have mudslides and landslides and so forth. So you've got this weird cycle in California, but in many other states now, of climate extremity or extreme weather driving up costs of home insurance. And in some
So,
places, they're
so
pulling out
yeah, I mean,
entirely.
this is happening in climate affected areas more and more commonly now.
Mhm.
Just in 2022, there were already 8 housing related insurers, property insurers that were declared insolvent in Florida alone. Right. And
Mhm.
since then, we've added another, I think a dozen. So, if you live in climate affected areas like Florida, particularly Miami-Dade County, and certainly fire affected areas of California, your homes will be insurable by the fact that the insurance companies can no longer afford to insure them. And I've had this conversation with players like Swiss Re and others,
Yeah, the reinsurance
the big
companies that went on the hook.
reinsurers. Yeah. And their attitude is when these assets get too expensive, we'll just stop insuring them. And
Yep.
so then the problem is if you can't get insurance for a place in California or in Florida anymore, like this is, the trajectory we're on, then, you can't get a mortgage because you
Mhm.
can't get mortgage insurance, right?
It kills the local
So
market.
right. So unless the government steps up, hashtag socialism, to provide insurance, then the reality is the only people that can afford to buy homes in those areas will be, property buying companies, the landlord class again, and, wealthy people that can afford to, like basically do commercial lending deals, for buying property in bulk and so forth. But, that's even before we start talking about the real impact of climate on,
And, and it's
Miami
not
and so
just
forth.
California and Florida, because the any coastal city now is
Yeah.
subject to hurricanes and extreme weather, and any place west of the Mississippi in North America is going to be subject to fires and droughts. Remember, in the heat of the fire season, we're going to have fires from British Columbia and Alaska all the way down the
Yes.
west coast to Mexico, through the Rocky Mountains. So it's hardly limited to California. And that's the problem for the insurance companies. If it were limited to one state, they could pull out or they could mitigate it by raising prices. But if it's multiple states and multiple challenges, whether they're sea related or fire related, uh, this becomes an unsolvable problem. And insurance is one of the few companies that spends a lot of time thinking about the future, because that's essentially what it is, about a future scenario.
Yeah.
So these are organizations that understand the implications of future scenarios, and they have to make financial decisions accordingly. And they're very conservative about how they manage that. I think these are telltale signs then that climate change is way more serious than most people tend to think about it, at least here in
So
the.
it's interesting. I'm just looking at a report that the New York Times did back in March, and they looked at a bunch of states where insurers are already impacted by climate in terms of property insurance,
Mhm.
and it includes states that I
You wouldn't
wouldn't have
expect.
wouldn't have thought, like in the
Yeah,
Midwest,
yeah,
Ohio and places like that.
yeah.
So it's not just it's yeah, it's not just the coastal areas either, but um, so it really is sort of upending the insurance market right now. As you said, it's wildfires, windstorms, the hurricanes and so forth as well. But yeah, insurance industry lost money on homeowners coverage in 18 states last year. This is in 2023.
That's
The list
crazy.
includes Kentucky, Michigan, Utah, Illinois, Georgia, Arkansas, and Washington. So, and then the biggest states across the Midwest that have been affected: Iowa, Minnesota, Indiana, and Ohio. And these are states where they've seen insurance companies stop writing homeowners insurance or making it much harder to qualify for coverage, and raising rates by 50% more in at least some of the areas of of those states.
That's what's happening. So, Brett, let's think about that for a second, because there's some pretty big implications. So, the first thing we talked about is the rise in the price of homes, of buying a home, and how the hope or dream of owning a home is elusive for a whole generation. The second one we talked about is the rising cost of rentals. And there seems to be some evidence of collusion or price fixing. We'll find out. That's a case that's being prosecuted right now. So we'll get an answer to that question in the future in the legal system. But then we also talked about the rise of insurance, home insurance. And if you are renting, you're going to be paying for that as well through the price of the rent. So that that's going to touch the homeowner or the renter no matter what. These things together are driving political instability. Because we keep getting a message from economists and from politicians that inflation's over and we've managed it. And relative to other countries, that's actually true. The United States has managed to come out of this inflation cycle better than most other countries. However, consumers don't see it that way because their costs keep going up. And it's not just the cost of home ownership or rental or insurance. It's also the cost of groceries and the cost of gasoline.
Yes.
These prices are much higher now. And that's fueling this kind of
but this comes back to the fact that we don't have real wage growth in the United States, and we haven't since the 80s, essentially. Real wage growth has been stagnant. So what happens is you might get some increases in your salary over time, but it's not comparable to the cost of living increase that
it doesn't keep up.
So
that's
that gap
exactly right.
Keeps raising. And, that's why you are now starting to have people at the bottom end of the middle class slip into what we call lower income brackets now, because of their disposable income is significantly reducing and they're having to use credit a lot more. So this is happening, but this is not happening just in the United States. This is happening in Europe. It's happening in the UK, definitely. The UK, I was there a few weeks ago in London, and, everyone I was talking to is talking about how expensive it is, to live in London these days. It's happening, as you mentioned, in Sydney and Australia, So, like,
no doubt in Thailand, I'm sure the cost of living in Bangkok has skyrocketed.
Yeah, well, fortunately, it's still pretty cost effective here for meals and things like that. But housing has seen an incredible increase because a lot more people are moving to Thailand because of the cost of living.
Trend,
so digital nomads are choosing Thailand, but there's tons of construction and stuff going on here. So,
but every one of those digital nomads that moves to Thailand drives up the cost of a rent for the people from Thailand, like the regular Thai people that want to live there. So there's that cycle as well. What we're seeing then are factors that can be traced to they're fueling this drive towards populist governments where charismatic leaders, often strong men, will rail against the government because people are angry. They want to blame somebody. They don't understand how the connection. I don't think many people get the connection to insurance and climate change and so forth. It's very obscure to understand what's happening with the corporations that are buying up real estate properties. So instead, they vent their anger and frustration at government bureaucrats. That's an easy thing to blame. And there are plenty of politicians around the world now who are fanning these flames and getting people more and more outraged at government. Here in the United States, we seem to be sleepwalking towards an election where a now convicted felon, who's also under indictment for dozens of other issues, those cases will be pending through the election. He's cruising towards another a re-election, I should say. And this is astonishing because I don't think we're talking at all about what he stands for or what he wants to do. And Brett, we should talk a little bit about what a post-Trump election would look like. If Trump wins, what would the effect on the global economy be? Americans think a lot about domestic issues, and we are rightly concerned, I think, about the challenges and threats he presents to the machinery, the U.S. government, the justice system, and so forth. Those are bad things. and he seems to be like a destabilizing force who would attack institutions that have helped keep this country running. But on the international level, his antipathy towards NATO is clear. Like, he's made that very obvious. He is not going to step in and support Germany. It's a country
Right.
he's never supported. But, if folks aren't paying attention, Germany is in a very precarious spot right now because
Yeah.
the far right party, Alternative für Deutschland, is gaining and actually has a chance of winning. Now, if you haven't been paying attention to German politics, this is actually kind of important. When I was a young man, I lived in Germany. And at that time, the thought that a fascist or neo-fascist party could even be in government was preposterous.
Yeah.
Well, today, a neo-fascist party is actually the leading party, and they're gaining momentum.
That's
And a
crazy.
lot of that is because of populist backlash against things like migrants and support for Ukraine and immigrants coming in from Syria and so forth. Policies that were generous and kind and in keeping with Germany's previously, kind of social democratic leanings. But that's changed. Now there's a backlash, and that backlash is here. And of course, there are plenty of international adversaries that are going to fuel those flames and fan those flames and drive that. So that's a state that's precarious, but it's not the only one. NATO itself turns out to be pretty delicate. NATO, I mean, we tend to take it for granted, but NATO has prevented a war in Europe for 70 years. And if you look
Yeah.
at the 70 years that preceded NATO, the savings on that investment, the benefits of that investment have been immense for generations, but we tend to take it for granted. I think the second thing we take for granted is the stability of the global supply chain. We tend to
Right.
think it's normal that you can order something on the web and get it delivered to your home a couple days later. But when you click on that button to buy something, you're setting in action machinery, digital machinery around the world that is, packaging up products that are made in Asia and put on a ship and sent through a container port and delivered to your home. This is a fascinating process for me, but it's out of sight and invisible to most people. Well,
Yeah.
all of
Just
that
look at what
relies
happened with the Panama Canal with that one ship getting stuck there, right?
in the Suez Canal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Suez
And
Canal. Sorry.
yeah, and
And
so
the
this is it.
same
Like,
with
it's
what we've seen with grain shipments out of Ukraine. The
and the
during the
rocket
pandemic.
attacks by the Houthis on the
Yeah. Yeah.
coast of Yemen, right? So it doesn't take much to upset that global supply chain. Of course, we all lived through that through COVID. That seemed like an extraordinary circumstance. But one thing that seems like a very clear implication of Trump's reelection, if he's reelected, so he's going to have a lot less interest in supporting faraway places and
Right.
intervening in faraway conflicts, meaning there'll be less stability in those global supply chains.
Yes.
And it's really a good idea for people who are listening to take a look at the products you buy, the stuff that you like to have on demand, and think about where is it made and how does it get shipped to me? Because chances are very good the ingredients or the components of that are created in a faraway place and they go through that global supply chain. And so you're going to be dependent on that. We saw in COVID that just one part missing can shut down an auto factory, even if that auto factory is based in the US or in Mexico. If they're dependent on one part through the supply chain, they can't finish the cars and the whole thing shuts down. This interconnected web is the most intricate thing humans have ever built. More than 1 million companies in hundreds of countries around the world participate in the supply chain. And if the United States pulls back from guaranteeing safe sea transit, then we're going to have a world of instability. That might benefit the US in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to cost everybody dearly. We'll
So
revert back to the 19th century.
the other element of this is sort of the fiscal policy stuff. Again, Trump was never really strong on fiscal policy. I mean, he was dealing with the disaster that was COVID as well, so
Mm-hmm.
it was a tough environment. But he's made clear that he doesn't want an independent in at the Fed.
Yeah, the
And so
treasury.
that sort of changes the real dynamic of the Fed. And
Manipulate the
let's
currency.
right. And if it's a Republican-led Congress, which is doubtful now, given the number of Republican moderates who are resigning, but it's not out of the question. But if Republicans retain control of the House and have control of the Senate, then you can bet that they're going to sort of extend the tax benefits to the wealthy, because that's the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And then that means essentially US debt spirals out of control. Now, at the moment, and I don't want to get into the China versus US thing because we still have to do that show, but I will say this, is that today, currently, the US is expected to hit a debt cliff in 2038. That's
Yeah.
200% of GDP, right? And at that point, what happens? I mean, that's 14 years away, right? It's not a long time, right?
Not.
In 14 years, you could have zero confidence in the US dollar because of the debt cliff, right? Or zero confidence in the US economy. Now, this is really where I come back to the Trump thing, because if Trump gets in, it's likely to accelerate the accumulation of debt and sort of kick that can down the road, because the Republicans are not going to aggressively go after a surplus or
They're not going to raise taxes on anybody.
right. And they might try and reduce the size of government. And there is some benefit in the late 2020s of applying automation potentially into government that could reduce the size of government in the 2030s. But it's not going to be enough to impact this. And on a secondary element, as we start looking at supply chain automation, as you've said, Trump has been very clear that he doesn't want CBDCs and central bank digital currencies, and that means you can't really have high levels of automation consistent with what we're seeing China invest in. So you're going to start to get a divergence where China is going to start to accelerate in terms of next generation supply chain, and the US is going to be stuck very much in the industrial view without the fiscal policy support to rein in the debt. And so those combinations are very damaging for economic stability in the longer term for the US, for sure.
It's a bad idea in general to crank up debt in peacetime or when there's no economic crisis. It's profligate living, and that's true for individual households as much as it is for a country. Why don't we go to a break, and then we'll continue this now dire conversation and prognosticate about what's coming in the future. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with my friend Brett King. We'll hang on tight because we'll be right back after this announcement.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to The Futurists. I am your host, Brett King, with Rob Tercek. We're doing this show together. We should do this more often, Rob. There's just chat between us as two futurists.
Fun to catch up. Okay, so we painted a pretty dark picture there. Although I think that is a decent default scenario if things don't change. If we proceed
it's
on
not.
the current trajectory.
It is a dark picture if we don't do anything, right? Yeah. And that's the human condition. We wait. What's that Churchill quote about?
America always does the right thing after it's exhausted all other possibilities.
And I think, but that's true of generally of humanity, right? When it comes to let's look at climate. We've known, since certainly the middle of the last century, we've known that climate's an issue. We've known that fossil fuels are contributing to climate. And also, killing 7 to 10 million people a year due to pollution. So we've known all of that. What have we done about it?
Very little.
Look at the stock market, record stock market. Look at those stocks.
Baby, drill.
Look at those oil stocks go. And so, this is a sort of, I mean, the listeners have heard me talk about my feelings on the need for reform of capitalism as a result of that. But everything we've talked about comes back to sort of this core economic value system that we've created, the rent prices and so forth. And it just seems to me, as we look at all of these different elements, the looming US debt, the housing affordability crisis globally, the impact of climate on that, let's not even talk about eco-refugees and food scarcity. We seem to be barreling headlong towards this and not mitigating this risk because it's not immediately apparent that this is going to be as big a risk as it could be, right?
So it's short-term policy and a lack of long-term thinking and planning.
And that's why everyone has to think like futurists, right? But
that's the point.
But at the same time, by the time we know it's real, by the time it's unavoidable, the conclusion that you can't afford to own a home anymore, you can't afford to insure a home, you can't get work because AI is taking it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By the time all of those things are readily apparent, then it'll be like, well, we can't like turn the ship instantly. It's going to take some time to adapt.
Well, and you have fewer
And
choices, right? You have fewer
yeah,
choices
yeah,
because some of
exactly.
the things we're talking about have geometric consequences or consequences that are increasing at a geometric rate. And that's a real problem because it means it's going to cost a lot more to intervene later. That's certainly true with climate. That also seems to be true with economic crises. And it probably would be true with geopolitical deterrence. Like an ounce of
Right.
deterrence is worth a pound of war. So that would also be true there, I think, in terms of peace or stability. And yet it's extremely hard to sell any of this to people today because people today want relief. They want relief on rent prices and grocery prices and gas prices and so forth. That's what they demand. Politicians are going to cater to that. It's very hard to be an advocate for the future, and the future doesn't have a lobbyist. The present
Yeah.
businesses have a lobbyist, and they're spending outrageous amounts of money right now to make sure that Congress supports them or that other representatives in other countries support their policies. But there's no futurist who has a lobbyist. And as a result, there's very few people who are advocating for decisions that would make long-term strategic sense. But that also creates a business opportunity, right? So the
It
idea there is
does.
if nobody's addressing something and there's going to be a great need for it, then there's a long-term opportunity. For instance, on this show, we've talked from time to time about synthetic biology. And I'm guilty of having said synthetic biology is one of those industries where the sun never really rises, right? It's like a perpetual sunrise in the sense that it never really seems to catch on. Of course, that's not true anymore because we all experienced this with Moderna and Pfizer vaccines during COVID.
Right.
Those were the product of synthetic
Well, you could say
biology.
the same of quantum right now, right?
Well, that's what we'll get to next.
Or
Hang on, hold on, hold on, hold
fusion.
hold that thought because I'm setting you up for a great bit on quantum. But I just had a conversation with this synthetic biologist while I was in New York, and he said, in addition to the great insight in developing vaccines during COVID,
Was it
he
Andrew
said they've
Hessel?
already done sequencing now on this new variant of the flu that's kind of making its way through cattle.
Okay.
And he said that we'd be able to develop a vaccine for that should it mutate in a negative way, in a very bad way, which he thinks is likely. We'll be
Mm,
able to develop a vaccine for that in a matter of a week. That's
wow.
synthetic biology applied. And another place he
Wow.
pointed out that it's happening, this is long-term thinking, is they're developing crops that can withstand drought and heat. So they're developing a new kind of crop. This is a big issue here in the US because a lot of the farmland that we benefit from that feeds the country is also subject to drought. And as the
Yes.
temperatures rise and fires and flood and so forth, that cycle continues. It's going to be increasingly difficult to grow there with the current methods. So some synthetic biologists are focusing on developing new kinds of food-bearing crops that can grow in difficult, dry and hot climate conditions. So there's an example of people looking at the long term saying, wow, nobody else is addressing this. And that creates an opportunity to start to devise a long term solution. There can be some real economic benefit or economic win in developing long term solutions. Now tell me about quantum, because I definitely want to hear what you have to say.
So I was in Riyadh a couple of months ago at Leap, which is sort of the biggest tech conference in the region. And they had all major announcements. Google announced new cloud initiatives, Microsoft, AWS, all of them, launching AI-based cloud initiatives there and so forth. But what was interesting is I met with the CEO of IBM and had a chat with him about this is Arvind Krishna. And I had a chat with him about their progress on quantum and the level of when we can get to a quantum computer that has sufficient error correction. They're saying 100,000 qubit quantum computer is the target. And we're talking, about 5 to 7 years away from that. So Krishna said, probably 5 years. Now,
Oh,
which is pretty interesting, right? So you now have reliable quantum computing within, let's say, by the end of the decade. Okay. What does that mean? one of the most impactful things of that, and obviously not everybody is going to have access to a quantum stack, but we can see Microsoft and Amazon and others looking to integrate quantum into their cloud stack already. Microsoft is already doing this today, as they have done with ChatGPT. But here's the point, have you heard of Q Day, Quantum Day?
I've heard of it, but tell the audience and me what it
the
means.
concept is. So the concept of Quantum Day is a day when quantum computers can break all existing RSA encryption that we use. So this is all of the SSL encryption we have in on the internet. This is all of the security you have in the banking systems today, in the telecommunication systems, in military encrypted communications, government secure communications, etc. So now let me join the dots for you a little bit to help you understand how close we are to Q Day. So you remember a couple of years ago when the US sent an F-22 up to shoot down a Chinese weather balloon over Alaska?
Yes.
This is not the only Chinese weather balloon the US has shot down. There's been a couple of them over the States, and there's been a couple of them over the South China Sea also. So why is China sending up these massive weather balloons with these aerials and satellite dishes and solar panels and so forth attached to them? They are capturing signals intelligence, encrypted signals intelligence. Right now, they can't decrypt these military communications, but they invested $15 billion in quantum computing technology last year alone, which shows you, if you put those two things together, they're trying to capture as much intelligence data as they can. And then when quantum comes along, they have the unlock key for all of the encryption of the previous military encrypted
So they're just
communications.
stockpiling a massive amount of intelligence, intercepted communications
Data
that they
mining.
can't currently read,
They
but
can't
someday
read it.
soon they'll be able to apply quantum
They'll
computing
be
and
able
decrypt
to.
the whole batch.
Right. And so think about what that means. Any pre-quantum encrypted systems become essentially wide open to state actors at least, and probably to some extent hackers who can get access to the quantum cloud, at that point. So particularly North Korean state actors as an illustration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and certainly China and Russia cyber forces and so forth.
And just to put this in perspective, Brett, we're not talking about people's Telegram messages to each other or their love letters or their sexy
we're
pictures
talking about
exchanging.
encrypted government and military communications. We're talking about the banking system, the telecommunications system, and the internet, right? If you aren't on a quantum cloud at that point using quantum encryption technology, all of the existing RSA type encryption could be broken, right?
And
Now,
that
you'd
also
have to...
includes cryptocurrencies, doesn't it? Crypto
Yes,
won't
Bitcoin.
withstand this because
Yep.
the whole point of crypto is it's encrypted using those techniques.
Right.
So what
And of
happens to my
the only
collection of
two...
NFTs, Brett?
Yeah. The only two organizations right now in the US that are working on post-quantum strategy is the US Defense Department, which is spending $1 trillion over 10 years on it, and Apple, right? So these are the only two organizations that have committed to a post sort of quantum security world, right? And it's interesting that two of these leading organizations are concerned enough about this that they're investing big money in this. So that's even before we start talking about the disruptive factors of artificial general intelligence and so forth, which could be coming around the same time. But imagine you can't use a banking app anymore. You can't use your banking app because it's not secure unless you're logged in on a quantum VPN or something, right?
So would we have to switch to like pre-digital communications? Is that what you're suggesting, or will we switch
No,
to some sort of quantum encryption?
So what I'm suggesting is that in the cloud stack, it's going to be fairly easy to put quantum encryption capabilities linked into modern clouds, right? So, and
So it'll
AI...
bind us tighter to the cloud companies. It's a way to lock us in.
Absolutely. So any bank
Great.
that's not on the cloud is no longer secure. And that is in the United States, 99.8% of banks.
I see. Oh, and will it be too expensive for people to run their own quantum computing stack to encrypt things on their own
Yes,
premises?
yes. But no, if they did it as an industry, it's possible. But even so, like FIS might run a quantum, right? But you're talking billions of
Right. That
dollars of
sounds like a new
investment.
fintech startup. So a quantum encryption for banks. That sounds like a
Yeah.
business opportunity. Get your entrepreneur hat on. Do you want to
Yeah.
talk about how that affects artificial intelligence? Because I don't have any inkling as to how quantum and AI intersect.
Well, I mean, the really interesting thing about quantum is the problem modeling and problem solving is that it
That's true.
enables us to really go after, I mean, we're going to learn so much more about physics, the nature of the universe. We're going to uncover proteins. We're going to understand, the way our bodies work, and the systems our how our body itself, the
Right. So,
systems
so it's
work
good for
together in a better
scenario
way.
planning because you can model
Right.
all probabilities simultaneously, right? So
Right.
for futurists, that's a great thing, right? That we'll be
Right.
able to see all the range of possibilities and calculate, I guess, a probabilistic weight against each of
So
those.
if you marry AGI with that problem solving capability, then asking the right questions and coming up with the right answers gets a whole lot easier. So the scientific advances that will be made on the top of those two technologies are just going to be breathtaking and very, very rapid. So we're going to see rapid improvement in terms of longevity techniques and being able to live longer. We're going to see diseases like cancers wiped out fairly quickly, all of that. We're seeing significant progress on that front already. But the combination of those things, massive, when you have very complex systems. So, for example, running a city, running a sanitation network, running a national energy network, all of those sorts of problems will be applied to this, and we'll see massive resource efficiency gains and so forth. But we'll have to automate those systems again, to get those benefits. And so,
Mhm.
you know, yes, we're shrinking government. That's fantastic. But think about all of the federal employees and so forth that will be automated out under those scenarios. But the advancements will be incredible. But
Yeah,
this is sort of
I
that
think new
that
careers are going to be
displacement.
created here. I think there'll be
Yeah.
new jobs created. I worry less about the job displacement.
All right.
But
Well,
think
we
about
we
this then.
don't we
So
don't
all those
we don't
digital
agree on that
twins that are
one. But
being built right now, those high fidelity digital representations of real world systems. And today you can run artificial intelligence on those. When you have enough historical data, you can start to predict how those systems will work under certain scenarios in the
sure.
future. With the addition of quantum computing, presumably, if we have enough instrumentation and enough data, we'll be able to model all scenarios simultaneously, and then we can start to live in a predictive world. I find
Yeah.
this a kind of fascinating idea. In a way, it'll take away some freedom of choice, right? Because that's one of the elements that we have right now. Because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, everybody makes their own decisions. But if you have much clearer picture of probabilistic outcomes, it's going to shrink the range of options that you'll have, at
No,
least
I
in the
guess I
rational.
guess this is where it gets really interesting because I think if you start looking at solutions to the problem set, the solutions to things like climate change, the housing crisis, etc., the reality is between AGI and quantum that there are going to be plenty of solutions presented. But those solutions are going to break the systems of government policy, the oligopolies that are in place. It's going to break the legal systems we have because it's going to be flying in the face of accepted human
Yeah,
logic. And we're going to be
yeah. Well,
forced to deal with those inequalities and inequities in the system in an upfront way, dealing with an alternative intelligence, negotiating that process.
never underestimate the human ability to make irrational decisions in the face of scientific evidence, right? We have a great
Yes.
ability to do that. The Club of Rome commissioned a study in
I,
1970,
I love this, the limits to growth
the limits to
thing.
growth,
This
where
is,
they
I don't
set
know why
forth.
more people don't talk about this. It's like
It's an incredible
2040 is
story,
the
right?
date, man.
For the
Yeah.
folks who are listening, so the Club of Rome were a group of influential Europeans who got together and said, "Gee, the world faces some big crises," and they did the first full scale model of climate change. This is in 1970,
Not
and
just
here it
climate,
is.
also economic impact,
Well,
right?
the economic
Long-term
impacts
economic.
of
Yeah,
climate.
yeah,
That's right, and
yeah.
it turns out those are eerily accurate. Like here we are today, 50
So do
years
you know the
later.
follow-up story on that? KPMG did a follow-up in
Yep.
2020, checking the veracity of that research, and they found it bang on. And
It was
so
bang on.
basically,
We
Right.
had the roadmap, but we've done
Yep.
none of the mitigating actions. Like we
Right. And
failed
so the
completely.
conclusion was we live on, we're seeking infinite growth on a finite planet. That was the premise of the research.
Yeah.
And they came up with this limits to growth concept, which is unless we put limits on economic growth, we're going to burn out the system. And in 2040, the entire economic system would collapse. And,
It turns
this
out
is
that
what,
prediction was pretty
yeah,
accurate, right?
we're right on
Okay.
track for
But
that.
that's a great illustration of the point that you can have the scientific evidence and you can show the trajectory and prove it. And people will
Right.
still make the wrong decisions for all the near-term thinking reasons, for all the near-term greed and profit decisions. So in other words, all those quantum scenarios that we may be talking about in the next 5 or 10 years, I think human capacity to ignore all that data,
Right. Most
make the
people
wrong
are thinking,
decision,
oh, great, I've got 5 years then. So let's maximize my return in 5 years
burn it
before the
all
system
down.
collapses. Right. Let's build a bunker in Hawaii or New Zealand.
Well, well, we're going to have PJ Manning on talking about protopian futures instead of dystopian futures because we have this habit of careening into the ditch every time we talk about long-term futures.
Well, but look, this is the thing: is there are solutions to this. This is not. There's not a technical limitation to solving these problems. We can produce enough housing for affordable housing for everybody. Why don't we? Policy, right? Economics,
That's
right?
true.
We could solve the refugee crisis at the southern border by looking at why refugees are leaving their homes. Again,
Yeah.
climate change is a
Stabilize their
big
home
issue, right?
countries. True.
This is not about the technology to address these problems. This is all about human nature and policy, right?
Yeah, the problem is that we talked about at the beginning of the show. It's very easy to game policy in the near term for near-term gain, and it's very difficult to influence policy for the long term. It takes some extraordinary insight for a politician to resist the temptation to take in the easy money
So
and make a long-term decision.
you're absolutely right, Rob. But let's finish on a positive note, right?
Yes, I
Because
want that
this
very
show,
much.
we're recording the show. It's going to go out tomorrow, so this is a quick turnaround for us because we wanted to sort of have a bit of a show with the two of us. It's the first chance we've had. But the big news I wanted to share today is that SpaceX successfully did their flight test number 4 for the Starship, which includes the booster and the Starship, or the ship that sits on top of it. Starship is the actual structure, right? And both of the vehicles landed safely. That is, conventionally safely in terms of they landed on the water, not on on land or on a recovery ship. But and the booster particularly did well. The Starship, or the ship on the top, it got into orbital velocity. And then they slowed it down the atmosphere. So it did a suborbital hop, essentially. It didn't do a full orbit. And it landed in the Indian Ocean. But they had a portion of the flaps that aerodynamically control the aircraft that burned through because of the intense heat. So one of the flaps sort of got destroyed, but it still did an upright landing on its tail. So we are getting pretty close to having the largest operational spacecraft in history that can put 100 plus tons into orbit every time.
So that's what it is. It's like heavy lifting from
Yeah.
Earth to the moon or to some asteroid. Is
Well,
that the idea?
initially to the moon and then to Mars, and they would start making flights probably, I don't know, in the early 2030s to Mars. But they need to put like 100 of these ships into orbit and have refueling in orbit, to do a sort of Martian colony attempt.
Would they
They
try to
base
launch to Mars from the Earth, or would they launch from the moon or from a space station where they don't have to deal with
They
the
would launch from
gravitational well?
orbit. So what happens
Yeah.
is it would
Okay.
go to orbit, right? With the passengers in the ship, it would refuel. It would take 5 or 6 flights to give enough fuel in the tankers to refuel
Mhm.
them. There'd be sort of a space tanker, which would be a converted Starship up in orbit, and they'd dock with that, and they'd have to do that for a number of these ships, and then they'd travel together as pairs. So if there was any issues, that they could, essentially dock the ships and take crew from one Starship to the other, if in the worst case scenario. But obviously, there's a lot of steps to go before they get to that. The next step is sort of making it human rated, or at least landing these successfully on an ongoing basis. Then they'll start to do orbital rendezvous. The next mission with Jared Isaacson, and the Polaris team, they intend to do a spacewalk for the first time with a commercially produced EVA suit. And then the second Polaris flight will be a docking with the Starship in orbit with a Dragon capsule. So pretty interesting. But this is a huge scientific advancement we've seen today. The first time we've seen a fully reusable stack like that actually land, with both the Starship and the booster. So congrats to SpaceX and
Awesome.
the team there.
It reminds me of a Ray Bradbury story. It reminds me of a science fiction story where a spaceship lands at the colonies on Mars, and it's the last human. He's like, well, we screwed up Earth, but we managed to migrate at least one person from that planet to Mars. And we kind of go on from there. I'm wondering if that's the scenario.
Kevin J. Anderson just released a new novel called Persephone, which talks about them going to Alpha Centauri B and to the planet Proxima B or whatever it is there, which is considered to be Earth-like, the closest Earth-like neighbor. But it's only on the Terminator where it's habitable, apparently, and sending the last surviving humans on a intergenerational starship to Alpha Centauri. So that could, if we don't get our act into gear, that could be the end game. So we got to start adapting and mitigating these risks, right? That's for clear.
So it's long-term thinking versus short-term gain. Well, fun catching up with you again, Brett. I always enjoy it. We should do this more often, and
absolutely.
We'll be interviewing more futurists. Actually, as soon as tomorrow, we have a great bunch of shows coming soon. But in the meantime, thank you to the whole crew for making the show happen. Brett, it's always good to see you on your travels. It's good to connect. And I'm looking forward to continuing these conversations about the near-term and long-term implications of future thinking. Well, folks, thanks. That's it for this week. We will see you next week with another group of futurists, experts who are thinking about or influencing or shaping the future. And until then, we will see you
in the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.